The alarm was already screaming when I opened my eyes. I had not even finished pulling myself into the captain's chair when Lieutenant Nora Hale's voice cut through every sound on the bridge like a blade. "Captain Voss, we have a problem. A very big problem." I looked at the main display. My stomach dropped. The rendezvous point was supposed to be quiet, a patch of open space near the outer edge of the Kale door system, far from traffic, far from trouble. I had expected to see the Corinthian Alliance fleet holding position, 40 warships in clean formation, their running lights blinking slowly in the dark. Instead, I saw fire, not the kind of fire you see in an atmosphere, the kind that dances and rises. This was space fire, pale and cold, the kind that happens when a reactor loses containment and vents superheated plasma into the vacuum. It does not burn for long, it just leaves behind wreckage and silence and the slow spinning of things that used to be ships. "How many?" I asked. Hale did not look away from her screen. 41 contacts. Confirmed destroyed. I am reading debris fields across 600,000 km. There are partial hole signatures from the Corinthian flagship, the Sorvithas Pride. It is in 4 pieces, Captain. 4. I had met Admiral Shorek of the Sorbit's Pride 3 months ago. He had shaken my hand with 2 of his 4 upper limbs and told me in careful and formal human standard that he was honored to stand beside Earth's warships. He had offered me a cup of something warm and faintly sweet that his people drank before battle. I looked at what was left of his ship. "Any survivors?" I asked. Scanning said inside Cole Marsh from the sensor station. He was young, 23, and I could hear the effort it was taking him to keep his voice flat and professional. He was doing well. "I have 1 contact, Captain. On an escape bot, Corinthian registry. It is still producing a life signal. Bring it in," I said carefully. While the recovery team worked, I turned to my tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Owen Price. He was a solid man, broad-shouldered with a habit of grinding his jaw when he was working through a problem. Right now his jaw was working hard. "What hit them?" I asked. "Iron scouring on every hole fragment I can read," he said. "Mass driver impact consistent with Imperial standard ordnance. Whoever did this used a full assault formation, multiple ships, coordinated fire, no warning shots." He paused. "This was not a skirmish, Captain. This was an execution." That word landed on the bridge like a drop tool. Everyone heard it. Nobody said anything. I stood up and walked to the forward viewport. Through the reinforced glass, the debris field drifted past in slow, indifferent silence. Pieces of ships that had been crewed by living beings 12 hours ago turned lazily in the starlight. I could see the markings on some of the whole sections, numbers, names, insignia, painted by hands that were gone now. I had been in tight situations before. Every captain who served in the outer colonial zones had been, but this was different. This was not a skirmish or a border dispute or a pirate raid. The scale of what I was looking at told very specific story, and I did not like the story at all. "Captain, it was Dr. Lena Burrows, our chief medical officer, coming through the internal comm. The escape pod survivor is aboard. He is in serious condition, but he is conscious. He's asking to speak to you. He says he cannot wait." I went. The survivor's name was Thesar. He was a Corinthian, which meant he had a long, narrow frame, pale blue skin and eyes that were large and set far apart, designed for seeing wide angles in low light. Right now those eyes were fixed on me from the medical bay bed with an expression I had only ever seen on a being who had watched something truly terrible happen and had not yet found a way to process it. His translator unit was clipped to the collar of his torn uniform. When he spoke, the device rendered his words into flat but understandable human standard. "Captain," he said, "the Empire has declared total subjugation protocol." I knew the term. Every diplomat and military officer in the outer sectors knew it. It was a designation the Galactic Empire used when it decided that negotiation was finished and conversion or elimination was beginning. It meant that every non-imperial species in the target zone was to be absorbed as a subject population or removed as an obstacle. There was no third option in imperial doctrine. "When was the declaration made?" I asked. "For cycles ago," he said. "We did not believe it. Many of our leaders thought it was a pressure tactic, a bluff." He stopped. His hands, all four of them, were lying flat on the bed beside him. I noticed they were very still, the stillness of someone who has nothing left to hold on to. It was not a bluff. "How many systems are affected?" "The entire Calor sector, 32 inhabited systems, billions of people." He looked at me with those wide, pale eyes. "Admiral Shorek sent the distress signal the moment the Imperial fleet appeared. He told me to get into the pod. He told me the humans would come." He paused. I told him that was not certain. He told me it was. He said humans always come. I sat with that for a moment. Then I stood up and walked back to the bridge. Dr. Burroughs followed me to the corridor door. "Captain," she said quietly, "he needs rest." "He will get it," I said. "I just need one more minute with him." I turned back. Thessar was watching me. "The colony on Kale Door," I said. "The one in the third orbital. How many people are still down there as of the last census?" He said 200,000 Corinthians and approximately 3,000 of your people. 3,000 humans on the ground. 200,000 people who had nothing to do with any of this except being born in the wrong sector at the wrong time, in 32 star systems, waiting to find out what total subjugation protocol meant up close. I walked back to the bridge. I did not have to say anything. My crew could read me. Nora Hale had already pulled up the tactical chart of the Kale Door system. Owen Price was running calculations on the debris field composition to figure out which Imperial formation had produced it. Colum Marsh was tracking every sensor return in a 4 light-hour radius with a focused attention of a man who knew something was still out there. My communications officer, Sergeant Danny Firth, looked up from a station. "Captain, I have composed a priority message to Earth Command, ready to transmit on your order." He hesitated. 14-hour signal delay, ma'am. Round trip is 28 hours. 28 hours, a lot could happen in 28 hours. I stood at the center of the bridge and looked at my crew, 340 people, the best ship humanity had put into space. Enough firepower and engineering ingenuity to make any reasonable opponent think twice. I thought about what Admiral Shorek had told Thessar, that humans always come. I had not asked for this. Command had not ordered this. The mission brief for this deployment had been liaison and observation, not engagement. If I sent a message and waited, I would be following the rules. I would be doing the correct sanctioned defensible thing, and while I did the correct thing, the Empire would be doing what it had been doing to 41 ships just a few hours ago. Danny, I said, send a message to command, tell them we have arrived at the rendezvous point and found the Corinthian Alliance fleet destroyed. Tell them we have one survivor. Tell them the Empire has activated total subjugation protocol across the sector, and tell them we are holding position at Caldor. Holding position, Captain. Holding position. I said, we are not leaving. Nobody on the bridge said anything, but I noticed that Owen Price stopped grinding his jaw, and Nora Hale's posture changed in a way that I recognized. It was the posture of someone who has been waiting for the order they expected to hear. I sat back down in the captain's chair. Cole, I said, I want a full sweep, everything in sensor range. Find me what is coming. Already running, Captain, he said. I looked out at the drifting wreckage of 41 ships. Command would tell me to fall back, observe, report. But command was 14 hours away, and those people down on Caldor Colony were alive right now, and the only thing standing between them and what had happened to Admiral Shorek's fleet was one ship and 340 people who had not been ordered to stay. We stayed anyway. That is the whole beginning of it. That is where the story starts, not with a grand speech or a plan or a moment of heroic certainty. It starts with a debris field and a question I answered before I had time to think too carefully about the answer. I flew toward the problem. That is what we do. The sensor sweep came back with 12 contacts. They were holding position on the far side of the debris field, using the wreckage of the Corinthian fleet as cover, which was an efficient and deeply unpleasant tactical choice. Imperial ships, Vanguard class, which meant they were fast, well-armed, and crewed by soldiers who had done this before. They were arranged in a standard suppression formation, the kind used to seal office system, while the main fleet moved into position behind them. They were not hiding. They knew we were there. They were waiting. Owen Price put the formation up on the main display and walked me through what he was seeing. 12 ships for heavies in the center, 4 mediums on the flanks for scouts. Forward, classic Imperial Vanguard doctrine. He tapped the display. There, designed to hold a perimeter while the primary assault force moves up, based on the destruction timeline of the Corinthian fleet and standard Imperial advanced doctrine. I estimate the main Imperial force will be in system with 48 to 72 hours, which means these 12 ships are here to make sure nobody leaves. I said, yes, Captain. I looked at the formation for a long moment. 12 ships to R1. In any conventional military calculation, those are very bad odds, but I have never put too much faith in conventional calculations, because the people who write them tend to assume that both sides are playing the same game by the same rules. The Empire's rules were built around opponents who reacted to strength with retreat. Their doctrine was designed to win quickly, to overwhelm, to make continued resistance seem irrational. They had never met a species that thought continued resistance was the only rational response. Danny, I said, open a channel to the lead Imperial ship. There was a brief pause while the communications handshake worked itself out between our system and theirs. Then the display shifted, and I was looking at an Imperial commander for the first time in my career. He was tall with the angular features and pale, almost gray Skin common to the core Imperial. Species the Veil, his rank insignia marked him as a commander of Vanguard, which Imperial hierarchy put him a significant step below Admiral, but well above anything that took orders rather than gave them. He looked at me the way a person looks at something unexpected and slightly puzzling, not afraid, not impressed, just assessing. Human vessel, he said through his own translator, you are operating in a contested zone under Imperial authority. Identify your purpose and prepare to receive boarding inspection. His name, as we would learn later from recovered Imperial ship logs, was Vale Karath. He had been in service for 20 years. He had participated in the subjugation of a systems. He was not the kind of person who expected to be surprised. I looked at him and I said, Commander, this is Captain Aravos of the United Earthship Blackstar. I'm going to give you 4 seconds to reverse your formation and withdraw from the Caldor system. If you do not, I will assume you're not interested in a peaceful resolution, and I will act accordingly. I paused. 4, 3, he blinked. I do not think anyone had ever counted down at him before. 2, he opened his mouth to speak. 1, I said, Owen, you have the board. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not a battle in the way that word is usually understood. A battle implies 2 sides engaging on roughly comparable terms, each trying to outlast the other. What happened in those 11 minutes was more like a collision between 2 completely different ideas about how a fight was supposed to go. The Imperial Vanguard opened with a standard suppression spread. It was the same pattern that had destroyed the Corinthian fleet. Overwhelming simultaneous fire across multiple vectors designed to saturate a target's point defense systems before a decisive strike could be mounted against any ship they had ever fought. It would have worked. The Blackstar was not any ship they had ever fought. Chief Engineer Ruiz had spent 18 months designing the Blackstar's point defense grid around a single principle, that a human crew under pressure would always push any system harder than its rated limits, and therefore the system needed to be built with that in mind. The point defense AI did not wait for confirmed hits to begin evasive recommendations. It was already moving the ship before the first Imperial salvo reached optimal range, threading the Blackstar through the gaps in the fire pattern within efficiency that looked almost lazy from the outside but required every calculation the ship's computer could manage. The first Imperial salvo did not find us where they expected. We found them exactly where I expected. Owen Price was not a dramatic man. He did not narrate engagements or announce strikes with any particular flair. He simply did his job with a steady and focused competence that I had trusted for 3 years. In those 11 minutes he coordinated our rail gun batteries with the precision of someone who had mapped every weakness in Imperial Vanguard formation doctrine and had a very clear plan for addressing each one in the correct sequence. The rail guns fired at a fraction of the speed of light. The rounds were simple, dense, and very fast. They did not carry explosive payloads. They did not need to at that velocity. Impact alone was enough to do what needed to be done. And the Imperial ships designed to fight opponents who used energy weapons and conventional warheads had not built their shielding around the idea of something small and very dense arriving faster than their defensive systems could track. The 4 Heavy Imperial ships were neutralized in the first pass, the mediums scattered, which is what the doctrine told them to do, breaking the formation to deny us. Concentrated target, but Owen had anticipated the scatter, and Nora Hale had already laid in the intercept. Solutions: the Blackstar moved through the debris of the heaves and picked up the mediums one by one, not rushing, not panicking, just working through the problem with the calm, methodical attention of people who had a job to do. And were doing it. We took hits. I want to be clear about that because it matters. 3 of the Imperial mediums managed to coordinate their fire before we reached them, and for about 90 seconds, a Blackstar was absorbing more punishment than I was comfortable with. Deck 7 took a direct mass driver strike and lost pressure, for crew members were injured. Inside, Tara Gibbs, who had been running secondary sensor sweeps from a forward station, was caught by shock wave through the bulkhead and taken to medical with a broken arm and a concussion she did not notice until after the engagement, because she stayed at her station until the shooting stopped. That is the part that people outside the military tend not to understand. It is never clean. It never goes exactly according to the plan. People get hurt and the ship gets damaged, and you work through it because stopping is not an option, and the alternative to absorbing the hits is letting the hits land on people who cannot absorb them at all. By the time the scouts tried to run, we had already repositioned. Owen bracketed them before they cleared the debris field. 3 of the 4 scouts were neutralized before they reached jump distance. I'll let the 4th one go. It was not an accident. I specifically ordered Owen to hold fire on the 4th scout, and I watched it charge its jump drive and disappear into the dark. Then I turned to Danny Firth. Danny, I said, I want a tight beam broadcast on all Imperial standard frequencies, short message. I wanted to reach that scout before it completes its jump. Ready, Captain. Send this, I said. You are not hunting prey. You have found something else entirely. Danny sent it. The bridge was quiet for a moment. The engagement had lasted 11 minutes, and I was already hearing the damage reports coming in from Ruiz and engineering. Steady stream of numbers and compartment designations that I was sorting through, while simultaneously running the next problem in the front of my mind. Thessar had been watching the engagement from the medical bay on an internal screen that Dr. Burroughs had reluctantly unlocked for him at his insistence. When I checked in on him an hour later, he was sitting up, the blanket across his narrow blue knees, looking at me with an expression I did not immediately recognize. I have seen many battles, he said slowly. In my career I have studied the records of engagements going back 400 years of Corinthian history. I have seen the Corinthians fight in the Sari and the Dormold Compact, and 3 other species whose names have been lost because the Empire removed them from every archive it controlled. He stopped. I have never seen anything fight the way you just fought. I pulled the chair over and sat down. I was tired. My hands, which I've been keeping very deliberately still on the armrest of the captain's chair during the engagement, were now doing the small trembling thing they did after a significant amount of pressure had moved through my body and begun to leave it. We have had a lot of practice, I said. He looked at me. How long have humans been at war? I thought about it. With each other or with other species? He blinked. With each other. We have a complicated history, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I found myself thinking about for a long time afterward. Every species the Empire has ever destroyed believed that the Empire was the most dangerous thing in their part of the galaxy. They were afraid of it. That fear made them hesitate. We are afraid too, I said. I know, he said, but you do not hesitate. I did not have an easy answer to that, so I did not try to give one. I stood up and went back to the bridge. The damage reports from Ruiz were bad but not catastrophic. Deck 7 was sealed and would need major work. The forward port railgun battery had taken shrapnel damage and was running at 60%. We had used a significant portion of our railgun ammunition stores. We had people in medical. We had a ship that needed repair and a crew that needed rest, and 48 hours before what Ruiz called very specifically a much larger problem was scheduled to arrive. I called the department head meeting in the briefing room. I'm not going to pretend this is going to get easier. I told them the main Imperial force will be here inside of 2 days. What we just did worked because the Vanguard was not expecting us and was not calibrated for our capabilities. The main force will know everything the scout ship just saw. They will adapt. Owen Price nodded. He was already thinking several steps ahead, I could tell. However, I said I want to propose something. We do not have enough railgun rounds to fight a sustained engagement against 40 or more Imperial ships. We do not have enough hull integrity to take another hit like the one Deck 7 just absorbed without serious consequences. What we do have is time, a debris field the size of a small moon, and a chief engineer who once told me he could build a working propulsion system out of cafeteria parts if he needed to. At the end of the table, Ruiz looked up from the damage report on his tablet. He was a compact, careful man with grease on his hands that never quite came fully off no matter how hard he scrubbed. He had a small smile on his face that meant he already knew where this was going. Tell me what you need, he said. I need the debris field to become a problem for the Imperial fleet, I said. I need us to turn 41 destroyed Corinthian ships into a reason why the next Imperial formation regrets entering the system. The meeting went on for 4 hours. By the end of it, we had a plan. It was not a plan that any military academy on Earth would have taught. It was not in any tactical manual. It was the kind of plan that exists because a group of humans looked at an impossible situation, got very determined about the impossibility, and started asking questions that began with the words, what if? I went back to the bridge and looked at the debris field. There was a particular kind of silence that the debris field produced. It was not the silence of empty space, which has its own character, cold and indifferent and enormous. This was a silence that had something inside it. The memory of noise, of systems that have been running and crews that have been communicating and ships that have been alive in a specific mechanical sense that a working vessel is alive. 41 of those had become quiet. I was going to make sure their silence meant something. Ruiz came up to the bridge himself at one point during the planning, which he almost never did. Engineering was his domain, and he moved through it the way some people move through their own home in the dark, without thinking about direction. When he appeared on the bridge, it was usually because he had something to show me that could not be conveyed adequately through a comm channel. He stood next to the main display and pulled up a schematic of the debris field that his team had been mapping for the past several hours. You see these sections here, he said, tapping a cluster of contacts on the left side of the field. 3 heavy cruiser hulls still mostly intact. Their reactors are damaged, but the containment is holding. Give me 12 hours and I can make those reactors into something that nothing in that incoming formation will want to be close to. How close? I asked. Close enough that if any ship from that formation tries to push through that corridor, he said, the pilot will have approximately 4 seconds to realize the mistake before the mistake is complete. Do it, I said. He nodded and went back to engineering. Hale came to stand beside me after he left. She had been at her navigation station for most of the past 20 hours, and there were shadows under her eyes that she was ignoring with a particular determination of someone who has decided that sleep is a problem for a different time. You should rest, Captain, she said. So should you, I said. I will when you do, she said. We both knew that was not happening yet. She looked at the debris field on the display. Do you think the field will hold them? It will slow them, I said. It will hurt them. I do not expect it to stop them completely. Then what stops them? She asked. We do not stop them completely, I said. We make them pay enough for every meter of progress that they cannot afford to keep paying indefinitely. And while they are paying in this system, the resistance network I am building through Thessar takes the rest of the sector apart from the inside. She was quiet for a moment, processing that. Then she said, that is not a conventional military strategy. No, I said, it is not. She nodded once in the same way she did when she was filing something away. As understood. I will plot the evasion grids for the field engagement, she said. We should have at least 4 fallback routes through the debris in case the formation adapts faster than expected. Good thinking, I said. She went back to her station. I stayed at the display and looked at the incoming formation for a long time. The Imperial fleet was moving at a measured and confident pace, which was what you did when you had 40 ships and a strategic objective and no particular reason to believe the obstacle in your path was anything you had not handled before. They had seen 1 human ship. They had lost 12 ships to it, which was a genuinely terrible result by anyone's accounting, but they still had 40 ships coming and one of us waiting. They believed in their numbers. That belief was entirely reasonable. It was also going to be a problem for them. I had been in enough situations in my career to know that numbers tell you what is likely to happen and not what will happen. Numbers describe the average. Wars are not fought by averages. They are fought by specific people in specific moments making specific choices, and those choices are shaped by things that do not appear in numerical force comparisons. The Imperial fleet approaching us was full of soldiers who had been told their entire careers that overwhelming force was the answer to every question. That was true when the force was actually overwhelming, and against every opponent they had ever faced it had been overwhelming. They were about to discover what it felt like to be overwhelming on paper and find it insufficient in practice. I went back to the captain's chair. You did not end for nothing, I said quietly to the wreckage of Admiral Shorek's fleet. Then I got to work. The next 36 hours were the most intense of my career. Ruiz and his engineering teams went out in environment suits into the debris field. working in shifts across the clock, cutting and pulling and rewiring components from the wreckage of Corinthian ships. They were not salvaging those ships for parts in the usual sense. They were repurposing them, turning the mass and the remaining fuel and the intact reactor cores of 41 dead warships into something that the Imperial Advanced Fleet was going to find deeply unpleasant. The principle was straightforward, though the execution was anything but. A ship with a damaged reactor is still carrying enormous amounts of compressed energy. Ship with a working mass driver turret is still a threat, even if nobody is sitting in the gunner's seat. In a debris field that looks passive and random from long range looks very different up close when a field has been quietly reorganized into a layered trap with the heaviest reactor cores positioned at specific intervals and the turrets locked into preset firing solutions and everything wired to a central trigger point. Ruiz called it an automated minefield. He was being modest. What he built was a multi-layered gravitational and ballistic system that used the mass of the debris itself to funnel approaching formations into choke points where the waiting turrets and rig reactor cores could do the most damage. He built it in 36 hours with a team of 30 engineers working in zero gravity in the dark in shifts in suits that had already been through more use than the manufacturers had intended, with components that had been through the kind of trauma that tends to make electronic systems unpredictable. He built it and it worked, but I'm getting ahead of the story. While Ruiz worked on the field, I was managing something else. Through Thessar, I had begun making contact with the Corinthian resistance network that had survived the initial Imperial assault. They were scattered, hiding in deep orbit around the outer planets, running silent, frightened and grieving, and not sure what to do next. I told them what to do next. I am transmitting everything we have on Imperial Vanguard battle doctrine. I told Thessar, who relayed the information through his own encrypted Corinthian channels, their formation patterns, their communication frequencies, the gaps in their point defense coverage, every weakness we identified in the engagement with the 12 ships. I want every resistance cell in this sector to have it. Thessar looked at me carefully. Why? Because one ship is not enough to hold this sector, I said. But 30 systems worth of people who know exactly how to hurt the Empire's ships. That is something else entirely. He was quiet for a moment. You're not just trying to defend Caldor, he said. No, I said, I am not. The colony on the third orbital of Caldor held 3,000 humans, engineers, traders, diplomats, researchers, and their families. When I got my first communication through to the colony director, a steady and sharp-minded woman named Claire Donovan, she had already begun organizing. We heard the engagement, she said over the calm, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who is very frightened and has decided not to let it slow them down. What do you need from us? Whatever defensive positions you can establish, I said. Improvised whatever you have. I need the Imperial ground force if it gets that far to find a harder target than it expects. Understood, she said. How long do we have? I'm working on extending that window as far as I can, I said. I will tell you the moment I know more. She nodded once and closed the channel to start working. The people in that colony had not trained for this. They were not soldiers, but they did what people do when the thing they love is under threat, and they have the option of doing something about it. They got organized. They were creative. They shared information and divided tasks and did not waste energy on panic, because panic is a luxury that people with a real problem in front of them cannot afford. I found out later that within 24 hours of my call with Claire Donovan, the human population of Caldor had drawn the Corinthian civilian population into coordinated defensive operation, established improvised communications networks across the settlement grid, and set up 8 fallback positions using construction equipment that CLA had repurposed in ways that its original manufacturers would probably have found surprising. 3,000 people who had woken up as engineers and teachers and researchers had become, through sheer refusal and improvisation, a defensive presence that would cost the Empire considerably more than it expected. But all of that was still ahead. On the bridge of the Blackstar, 31 hours into the preparation window, Cole Marsh looked up from his sensor station. "Captain," he said, "I have contacts. Multiple contacts emerging from jump at the outer edge of the system." I stood up. "How many?" I asked. He counted. His face did not change, but I knew what that meant. It meant the number was significant. 40 ships, Captain, he said, plus one very large contact that I'm still resolving. It is significantly bigger than anything in the Vanguard profile. I looked at the display as the contacts appeared one after another, bright shapes spreading across the outer system like a net being drawn closed. 40 ships and something bigger. "Danny," I said, "is the trigger system for the field online?" "Online and responding, Captain," he said. "Owen," I said, "railgun status forward port battery at 60%. All others at full," he said. "Ruiz," I said, "over the internal channel. Engineering ready, Captain." His voice came back, steady as always. He had slept exactly 3 hours in the past 2 days, and you would never have known it from his voice. I sat down in the captain's chair and watched 40 ships and something very large begin their approach into a system that I had spent 36 hours making as unwelcoming as possible. "Cole," I said, "keep resolving that large contact. I want to know exactly what we are dealing with." "Working on it, Captain." The debris field drifted in the dark ahead of us. The trap was set. The colony below was as ready as it was going to be. My crew was at their stations doing what they have been trained to do, doing what humans do when there's a line and the line needs holding. I looked at the display. "Here we go," I said. Nobody said anything. We went. The first wave reached the debris field 6 hours after the Imperial fleet entered the system. They came in an attack formation I had not seen before, which told me that the scout ship had made it back and that someone in the Imperial command structure had looked at the sensor logs of the engagement with Vale Caratha's Vanguard and had made adjustments. They were not using the standard suppression spread. They were coming in tighter, faster, using their own mass driver fire ahead of the formation to clear a path through the debris as they advanced. It was a smart adjustment. It was not smart enough. The debris field was 41 ships worth of wreckage spread across 600,000 km, and clearing a path through it with mass driver fire meant that you were sending dense, fast projectiles into a space filled with unstable reactor cores and preset turrets and a whole collection of things that Ruiz and his team had arranged with considerable creativity. The first large detonation came from Reactor Core 7, which Ruiz had positioned in what looked like a passive drift but was actually the precise impact point for the most likely clearing fire trajectory. The explosion caught the two forward Imperial ships in a blast radius and pushed them sideways into the preset turret arcs where three Corinthian mass driver turrets still attached to whole fragments and running on emergency power opened fire with the patient reliability of automated systems that do not know they are supposed to be finished. Two more Imperial ships lost maneuverability before the formation could adjust. The formation adjusted. They always do, but adjusting under fire in a debris field that keeps producing new problems is not the same as adjusting in open space, and the Black Star was not sitting still while they worked it out. We moved through the outer edge of the field in a pattern that Owen had designed to appear unpredictable from the outside but was in fact precisely calculated to keep us in the gaps between the Imperial fire solutions, while staying close enough to the triggered sections of the debris to benefit from each detonation. We were not the main weapon in this phase. The field was. We were the reason that Imperial ships could not simply stop and neutralize each threat one at a time. Every time the formation paused to deal with a section of the field, we closed range and used the rail guns. Every time the formation moved to engage us, another section of the field produced a problem behind them. Ruiz monitoring everything from engineering was narrating the field performance over the internal channel in a quiet, focused voice that I found studying. Reactor cores 4 and 9 are still at full pressure. Captain Tor arrays B through F are online. We have lost the C section early. One of the timer relays failed before its program moment, but the secondary in that zone is compensating. Good, I said. Also, he said Deck 9 conduit reroute is complete. You have full power to the aft railgun battery again. Very good, I said. In a medical bay, Tara Gibbs had signed herself out against Dr. Burroughs' instructions and returned to her sensor station with a stabilizing brace on her arm and a bandage around her head that she kept adjusting with her good hand every few minutes. I did not send her back. I needed everyone. The engagement with the debris field lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, the Imperial advance formation had lost 8 ships, not all destroyed outright, though 3 of them were. The others had lost engine capacity or weapons systems or structural integrity severe enough that they had pulled back to the edge of the system rather than continue forward. 8 ships out of 40. Empire still had 32 functional warships in system, plus the large contact that Cole was still resolving. The contact hanging at the outer edge of the system like something waiting for the right moment. But 8 ships was a number the Empire had not planned for. It was a number that bought time, and time was the resource I was spending as carefully as I could, because every hour I kept those ships occupied in the system was an hour in which the resistance information I had given Thessar was spreading through the sector. I got confirmation of the first strike outside the system. On day 4 it came through the Thessar's network, a tight beam signal from a Corinthian resistance cell in the outer system of Dorevel. The cell had used the Imperial formation data I had shared to identify the resupply route between 2 Imperial forward bases and had struck a convoy of 4 Imperial supply ships with a kind of precise Targeted action that only makes sense if you know exactly where the targets. Defensive systems are weak. They had lost none of their own ships. They asked if I had more information. I had Hale compile everything we had gathered from the debris of the Vanguard ships, every piece of signal data and operational frequency we had pulled from the wrecks, and send it through the channel that same night. On day 5, 3 more cells reported successful actions in their systems. On day 6, Cole finally resolved the large contact at the outer edge of the system. It was an Imperial siege carrier, a class of ship designed specifically for extended planetary reduction operations. It carried enough bombardment ordnance to crack the surface of a planet and enough troops to occupy what remained afterward. It was not a warship in the traditional sense. It was a tool for removing populated worlds from the category of inhabited places. It was moving toward Calor's third orbital. I had expected this. I had been preparing for it. The Empire had tried the direct approach and found it slower than anticipated. Now they were going to attempt what they were actually there for, while using the remaining warships to keep the Black Star occupied. I called Claire Donovan. She was sitting in what looked like a converted storage room, surrounded by maps and communication gear, with 3 Corinthian coordinators working quietly around her. She looked like she had not slept in 2 days, which I suspected was accurate. The siege carrier is moving toward you, I said. I can see it on our ground-based sensors. She said, what do we do? You have 8 fallback positions. I said, you make them use every single one. You make them work for every meter of ground. The longer this takes on the surface, the more time the resistance network has to cause problems across the sector, and the harder it becomes for Imperial Command to justify keeping this many ships in one system. She looked at me steadily. How long do we need a hole? I told her the truth. I'm working on that. She nodded once and went back to her maps. I stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the tactical display. The Empire had sent 32 warships and a siege carrier to remove 203,000 people from planet. By any standard measure of force, the outcome should not have been in question, but standard measures assume that one side is going to accept the reality presented to it. Owen, I said, Captain, I want options for engaging the siege carrier without going through 32 warships to get there. He looked at the display. He was quiet for exactly 9 seconds. Then he said, I have one idea. You're not going to like it. Tell me. I said. He told me he was right. I did not like it, but I listened to the whole thing, and when he was finished, I said, can Ruiz make it work? Owen said. He says yes. Then we're doing it. I said. The plan was to go directly through the Imperial formation, not around it, through it at the highest velocity Ruiz could produce from our drives on a vector that used the formation's own spacing against it, threading between ships at a distance that would make it very difficult for any one of them to fire without risking hitting their own vessels. It was the kind of move that worked because it was so aggressive that the Imperial response doctrine simply did not have a prepared answer for it. Every tactical system the Empire used assumed that opponents preserve distance. Distance was the fundamental assumption built into their weapons targeting, their formation spacing, their command timing. We were going to remove the distance entirely. Ruiz monitoring everything from Engineering delivered something that I still do not fully understand from physics standpoint, but which produced more velocity from our drive system than the specification said was achievable. I did not ask him how. I've learned not to ask Ruiz how when he has already told me. The answer is yes. The Blackstar accelerated. We went through the Imperial formation at a speed there. Targeting systems were not calibrated, for we took 3 direct hits at the velocity we were carrying, each impact distributed across whole sections at Ruiz had specifically reinforced for exactly this scenario. Deck 3 lost power. The F-port railgun battery went offline for 90 seconds before the backup engaged. 1 forward sensor array went dark permanently, but we came through the other side of the Imperial formation, and we were still moving, and the siege carrier was directly ahead of us, no longer protected by 32 warships, because those 32 warships were now on the wrong side of us. Owen fired 4 full salvos at the siege carrier's propulsion section. A siege carrier is not built for speed. It does not need to be agile, because it is never supposed to be in a position where speed matters. Its engines are powerful, but they're not designed for evasion, and when 4 salvos of railgun rounds hit those engines in a sequence that Owen had calculated to produce cumulative structural failure rather than a single impact that the carrier's armor might absorb, the effect was not immediate, but it was certain. The siege carrier's drive section failed over the course of about 3 minutes. The ship came to a halt in deep space while clear of the 3rd orbital. Its bombardment systems were still active, but without the positioning to use them on the planet below. I called Claire Donovan. The sea carrier is not moving, I said. She allowed herself a very small and very tired smile. Understood, Captain. The battle for Kalar was not over. The Empire still had 32 warships in system, and an immobilized siege carrier, and a sector that was now in open resistance across a growing number of systems, but the immediate threat to the surface had been stopped, and somewhere at the outer edge of the system of Scout was transmitting everything it had witnessed back to Imperial Command. I was counting on that, because Imperial Command was going to do what every large, powerful organization does when something has gone wrong in a way it does not understand. It was going to send someone more important to deal with it, and I have been building toward that moment since the beginning. The message came on day 8. I was in a captain's chair, running on 4 hours of sleep, when Danny FTH looked up from his communication station with the expression he kept for things that were genuinely significant. Captain, he said, we are being hailed. Type beam Imperial Command encryption. The center identification reads as Grand Admiral Methser. He is aboard the Imperial Dreadnought Eternal Dominion. The bridge went very quiet. I had read every available file on that ship, 5 km long. More firepower than the entire human colonial fleet, the personal flagship of Grand Admiral Methser, who had served the Empire for 40 years and had personally overseen the reduction of 14 civilizations. His name appeared in the historical records of every species the Empire had encountered in the past 2 generations. It appeared there as a word for a certain kind of ending. He had come to Kaeldor personally. I decided how to feel about that in about 3 seconds. I filed away the part of my mind that was registering the scale of his ship and focused on the part that Was thinking about why he had come, what? That told me about the state of Imperial decision-making after 8 days of what we had been doing and what he was to say. Before he said it, he would not have come unless something had gone wrong. Enough to require him. He was the kind of person who only appeared when the problem was too large or too unusual for his subordinates to fix according to existing doctrine, which meant the resistance network was working, which meant the damage was being felt at a level that had reached someone at the very top, and that someone had decided the human vessel at the center of all of this needed to be addressed personally. I straightened my jacket. I nodded to Danny, put him through. Methic was older than I had expected from the files, not diminished by age but settled into it, carved by decades into something very final and certain. He had the angular features and pale gray skin of the core Imperial species, but his eyes were dark and careful and clearly extremely intelligent. He wore his rank insignia the way some people wore their own face. Without ever thinking about it, he looked at me with that careful assessment I was beginning to recognize as the standard Imperial response to encountering something outside their catalogued experience. Captain Voss, he said. His translator rendered his voice low and measured. Your record of the past 8 days is remarkable. I have reviewed the sensor logs from every engagement. I wanted to speak to you directly, Grand Admiral, I said. What can I do for you? He studied me for a moment. You have caused significant disruption to the subjugation protocol timeline, the damage to the advanced fleet and the siege carrier. I anticipated as a possibility. What I did not anticipate was the intelligence you shared with the resistance cells. We have lost 14 supply chain contact across the sector in 6 days. That is not the work of one ship. That is the work of a strategy. Thank you, I said. He was quiet for a moment. You understand that the eternal dominion changes the situation. I understand what you believe it changes, I said. He looked at me carefully. I'm offering you an honorable withdrawal. Take your ship. Leave the system. The Corinthians are subject to the protocol regardless of your presence here. Your departure will not change what happens to them, but you will preserve your vessel and your crew, which is a reasonable outcome from an impossible position. His tone was not threatening. It was the tone of a person who genuinely believed he was offering something of value. He was in his own way being generous. I looked at him and, instead of answering his offer, I asked him a question. Grand Admiral, I said, how old is the Empire? He looked slightly surprised. The Empire in its current form is 1,040 years old. The Imperial line extends further. He paused. Why, and how many civilizations has it absorbed in that time? I asked. The number is, he paused, it is in the hundreds. And how many of them fought back effectively enough to require your personal attention? I asked. In your career of 40 years, how many times have you had to leave your flagship and come to a specific system because what was happening there could not be resolved through standard protocol? He was quiet for a long moment. 3 times, he said. Finally, in 40 years, 3 times, I said. In those 3 times, what was the outcome? He said, nothing. I have read the histories of every civilization your empire has absorbed or removed, I said. Not the Empire's versions of those histories. The originals preserved in Corinthian archives, in what survives of Serati records in the final. Transmissions of peoples whose names your empire removed from every archive. It controlled but whose records survived in the systems you had not yet reached. I leaned forward slightly. Every single one of them made the same mistake. They looked at the empire and they believed it was the largest, most permanent thing in their part of the galaxy. They thought what you want them to think, that resistance is temporary, and that what the empire does is inevitable. You watch me. We never made that mistake. I said, not because we are not afraid of you. We are afraid. We have been afraid since we understood what you were doing in this sector. But humans have been afraid of things larger than themselves for the entire length of our existence, and we have a very specific and deeply embedded response to that situation. And what is that response? He said, we get creative. I said. I nodded to Owen. What happened next had been built across 8 days of preparation. Starting from the first moment, I understood that the empire would eventually escalate to its flagship. The resistance network across the sector had not stopped its supply chain strikes over the past 4 days, using the Imperial communication frequencies we had identified from the Vanguard wreckage. Thesser's network had been quietly mapping the resupply and reinforcement routes for every Imperial asset in the sector, every convoy, every patrol schedule, every forward base on. My signal transmitted Imperial command encryption. All of that information went simultaneously to every resistance cell in 32 systems with a single attached instruction. Now the damage reports began reaching Messer within the hour. I could see the effect in his face as his own command system received what his subordinates were sending him from across the sector. He read each report carefully. His expression moved through several stages of something I did not think he had experienced in a very long time. Your resupply network across the sector is compromised, I said when I judged he had enough of the picture. Your forward bases in multiple systems are under coordinated action, not by me, by the species you came here to subjugate, who spent the past 8 days learning exactly how to identify and strike your vulnerabilities. I paused. The Eternal Dominion is the most powerful ship I have ever seen, but a flagship is only valuable when the fleet behind it can function. How long can you operate in this sector without resupply? He looked at me with those dark, careful eyes. You planned this from the moment you arrived, he said. The field, the carrier, the network. Yes, I said. From the moment I saw what you did to 41 ships, I understood that you would escalate, so I spent every hour that followed building toward the moment you arrived. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I had not expected. Captain Voss, what I am about to do is not a surrender. The Empire does not surrender. I understand, I said. I am implementing a tactical withdrawal pending resupply and strategic reassessment. In any language, that means the same thing, but he did not simply leave. I want to be clear about that. Mythic was not a person who walked away without trying first. Eternal Dominion and the remaining Imperial warships engaged the Blackstar in a direct confrontation that lasted 37 minutes and was the hardest thing I have ever put my ship through. We lost Nora Hale. I'm going to say that plainly, because she deserves to be named plainly. A direct hit on a navigation station. She had been at that station for 3 years. She was 31 years old, and She had a younger brother back on Earth, who was studying engineering because she had told him it was the best way to see the galaxy. We lost 6 others in the lower decks in the forward sections. I will carry those names for the rest of my life. The Blackstar's hull took damage that Ruiz described as significant and then immediately began working on fixing, because that is who Ruiz is. The forward sensor array was gone. The port rail gun battery was gone. One of the drive pods was running at 40%, but the Eternal Dominion was crippled. Its armor was built for punishment that would have ended a smaller ship in moments, and Methzarek used every advantage his vessel carried. At close range, however, our rail guns were more effective than his energy weapons, and our targeting AI was faster than his gunnery crews. His drives took 3 direct hits. The Eternal Dominion withdrew at reduced speed. In 40 years of service, Mether had never retreated. Before the channel closed, he hailed me one final time. "Captain Voss," he said. His voice was the same, still measured, but something in it had shifted. Something that had not been there at the beginning of our conversation was there now, and I did not have a word for it. That satisfied me. "What are you?" I thought about the question. "We are the ones who stayed," I said. I cut the channel. The 37 minutes of the final engagement produced more battle log data than anything else in my career combined. I have read through it in the weeks since. I do not particularly enjoy reading it, not because of the technical content, which is actually a useful record of what our systems can produce at their limits, but because reading a battle log is a specific kind of reliving that I find I can only manage in short intervals before I need to put it down. What I can say about those 37 minutes without the log in front of me is this: Methic was an excellent commander, whatever else he was, whatever the Empire had used him to do. Over 40 years, he was genuinely skilled at what he had built his life around. He read the engagement in real time and made adjustments that a slower thinker would not have made, and those adjustments cost us more than they would have against a lesser opponent. He pushed the Eternal Dominion into positions that should not have been survivable for a ship its size, positions that used its mass as a weapon in ways that Owen noted afterward with something that sounded reluctantly close to admiration. He fought like someone who intended to win and could not understand why that intention was not producing the expected result. But intention does not bend physics, and physics was what we had going for us. The rail guns at close range, the speed, the point defense grid that Ruiz had designed around the specific knowledge that humans push things past their limits and had built in the safety margins accordingly. The targeting AI that was running calculations faster than any organic crew could match, and feeding Owen the solutions he needed, the precise fractions of a second that made the difference. Owen Price. I want to say something about Owen Price. He stayed at a station for those 37 minutes with the focused, contained stillness of someone who has made peace with what they are doing and has nothing left to spend on anything except doing it well. When the port rail gun battery went offline, he switched to the remaining batteries without breaking his flow. When the sensor resolution degraded, he worked with what he had. When a shock wave through the home knocked out the power to his station for 11 seconds, he was already reaching for the backup console before the primary came back. And when it came back, he was exactly where he needed to be. He is not a demonstrative person. He does not make speeches or show much on his face when things are difficult. After the engagement ended and the Eternal Dominion began its withdrawal, and the bridge was as quiet as it gets in the immediate aftermath of something like that, he looked at his tactical display for a moment and then said simply, "Contact is withdrawing, Captain. All primary threats neutralized or disengaged." That was all he said. I will trust that man with anything for the rest of my career. Danny FTH on the communication station had been managing the combat signals throughout, keeping our channels clear, monitoring Imperial frequencies, maintaining the connection to the resistance network, even through the interference that high-energy weapons exchanges produce. At one point, during the worst of the exchange, he picked up and physically moved a Damagecom relay component with his bare hands to restore a connection that was failing, and he had a burn on his palm afterward that he did not mention until Dr. Burroughs noticed it during the post-engagement check. Cole Marsh tracked every contact from the first moment to the last. His sensor readings were the foundation on which every decision Owen made was built. In an engagement where the difference between success and failure was often measured in seconds and in the accuracy of information about where the enemy's ship would be rather than where it was, Cole's work was load-bearing in a way that is hard to quantify but easy to understand. Ruiz kept the ship together. That is the only way I know to describe what he did. From the moment the first hit landed to the moment the last Imperial ship withdrew, he was managing a vessel that was being asked to absorb and function and continue to function. And he did it with a steady, relentless competence of someone who has made it their life's purpose to understand every system in their care deeply enough to keep it working when working should not be possible. These are my people. That is what I want the record to show, not just what we did but who did it. When Methzer opened the channel for the final time and asked his question, I was looking at the tactical display, and at the same time I was aware of all of them behind me and around me, and at every station on a bridge that had taken more punishment than I ever wanted to see a bridge take. 340 people minus 7 who had stayed when they could have gone, and had done what needed to be done, and had held what needed to be held. What are you? I stood up from the captain's chair and walked to the navigation station and stood there for a moment with my hand on the edge of the console. Then I went back to the center of the bridge and started working on the next problem, because that is what you do. That is all you can do. I wrote the final entry in my log 3 weeks after the Eternal Dominion withdrew from the Kale door system. I was in a medical bay when I wrote it. Dr. Burroughs had finally won an argument she had been trying to win for the better part of 2 weeks, and I had submitted to the necessary care for 3 cracked ribs, a concussion I had been managing around since day 4, main engagement, and a collection of smaller injuries that I had simply been too occupied to address. Lying in a medical bay bed is not where I prefer to compose official logs, but there are worse places, and Dr. Burroughs have been patient enough with my postponements that I owed her at least this much. Blackstar was still at Kale door. It was not going anywhere fast. Ruiz's teams had restored minimum drive function and full life support within 72 hours of the final engagement, but the whole damage, and the lost systems and the cumulative weight of what we had put the ship through over 3 weeks of continuous operation were not things that could be addressed without a proper repair facility. Earth Command had been receiving my transmissions throughout. Their responses have been arriving in sequence, each one about 14 hours behind the event it was responding to, which meant I had been reading Earth Command. Surprise and confusion and eventual dawning comprehension like a very slow series of chapters, one delivered every half day. The message that arrived on day 19 was from Admiral Fleet Commander Arjun Kapoor. He had the measured voice of a man who had spent long enough in command to have stopped being startled by most things, but the message he sent had the careful cadence of someone choosing each word with deliberate attention. Captain Voss, he said, we have been monitoring sensor data and resistance network communications from the Kale Door sector for the past week. The picture that emerges is he paused. In 10 years of following Capper's career, I had never heard him pause mid-sentence. It is significant. Please advise on your current status and the operational situation in the sector. I had sent my reply within the hour. Ship is mission capable, sir. I said, please advise on your definition of mission. That reply was, I will admit, slightly more pointed than standard protocol recommends, but I wanted him to understand that whatever came next was not going to involve the Blackstar leaving this sector. His response 14 hours later was not the correction I had half expected. Captain Voss, he said, the Earth Joint Council has convened an emergency session. The events in the Kalar sector have drawn the attention of 11 independent civilizations in the outer sectors who have been monitoring Imperial activity. In the region, we are receiving diplomatic signals from 5 of them, requesting formal communication with Earth. You appear to have started something considerably larger than a defensive engagement in one system. Another pause. We are sending the 2nd and 3rd Colonial Response Fleets to your position. Estimated arrival is 6 standard weeks. Hold your position. And Captain, well done. 6 weeks. I had not planned for 6 weeks. I had not planned for being in this system at all when I made the decision to stay. That now felt like it had happened in a different chapter of my life, but the 2nd and 3rd Colonial Response Fleets were 48 ships and 48 ships combined with what remained of the Blackstar and the resistance network that had been operating and learning across the sector for 3 weeks constituted a different kind of situation than anything we had been working with before. The diplomatic signals from the 5 independent civilizations were perhaps what I spent the most time with during the quiet weeks of repair and waiting. I read each of them carefully. They were different in tone and in the specific things they said. One was formal and cautious, one was detailed and analytical, one was brief to the point of austerity, one was surprisingly warm, one was written in a format that our translation systems initially struggled with, and that Thessar spent 2 days helping us properly interpret, but at the center of each one was the same basic understanding. These were species that had been watching the Empire expand for generations and had concluded each in their own way that the mathematics of the situation did not work out in any small civilization's favor, that the Empire was large and permanent, and they were small and temporary, and resistance was a path to exactly the kind of ending they had watched happen to other peoples, and then they had observed happened in the Caldor sector. One ship and 340 people and 203,000 colonists on a planet, a debris field turned into a trap, a resistance network built out of nothing and taught to strike. Effectively, a siege carrier stopped. Grand Admiral retreated. The mathematics, it turned out, was not what they had believed it to be. Thessar recovered well. Dr. Burroughs had him walking full corridors by day 16, and by the time I was lying in the medical bay, composing my final log, he was spending most of his time at a secondary communications terminal working with the resistance network cells that were still active across the sector, coordinating, sharing information, passing along the tactical analysis that Owen Price was producing each day based on everything we were learning from the ongoing engagements elsewhere in the sector. He had become something very different from the frightened being I had found in an escape pod. He had become necessary in a way that only happens to people who have found the thing they are supposed to be doing with their situation. On the morning of the final log, he came to the medical bay. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me for a moment with his wide Corinthian eyes. Then he said, "I have been in communication with cells and 14 systems. The Eternal Dominion has reached an Imperial repair facility, but has not redeployed. Grand Admiral Metzer has been recalled to the Imperial capital." A recall, I said. Not a reassignment. Correct, he said. A recall to report in person to the Imperial throne. That was significant in a very specific way. Recalls to the Imperial throne were not administrative events. They happened when something had failed at scale that required the Emperor to hear the account directly from the person responsible. It was not the kind of summons you received when things had gone moderately badly. It was the kind you received when something had gone wrong in a way that the Emperor needed to understand before deciding what to do next. I thought about what that meeting might look like. Metzerek, standing before the Imperial throne, describing what had happened in the Caldor sector over the course of 3 weeks. The debris field, the sea carrier, the resistance network, the drive through the formation, the final engagement, why the Eternal Dominion had withdrawn, what the sector looked like now with 32 systems in active resistance and 5 neutral civilizations reaching toward Earth and 48 human warships 6 weeks away. I wonder what word he would use when he tried to explain what we were. Thessar looked at me thoughtfully. He will tell the Emperor what he observed. How do you think the Emperor will respond? I have no idea, I said. That is partly the point. He tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? The Empire has spent 1,000 years developing a response for every situation. I said. It has protocols for everything. It knows what to do when a species resists, and it snorts knows what to do when a species surrenders, and it knows what to do when a species tries to negotiate or retreat or hide. It has encountered all of these and built systems for responding to each of them. I paused. It has not encountered this. It does not have a protocol for a species that shows up without orders to someone else's conflict, improvises a trap out of someone else's wrecked ships, teaches the local resistance how to identify and strike vulnerabilities, and then engages the Grand Admiral personally, because the alternative is letting him reach the surface. Thessar considered this. You broke its pattern. We always break the pattern, I said. It is not something we plan, it is just what happens when you put humans in a situation where the established pattern does not work in our favor. He was quiet. For a moment, the 5 civilizations who have contacted Earth, what do you think they want? Some of them want protection. I said some of them want trade, relationships, or information exchange. Some of them probably just want to know that the mathematics is different from what they believed it was and that they have more options than they thought. I looked up at the medical base ceiling. All of them have one thing in common. What is that? They watched, I said. They watched and they're still watching, and whatever happens next is going to be watched very carefully by a great many people in a great many places, which means that what happens next carries real weight. He nodded slowly. And what will happen next? The reinforcements arrive, I said. Earth has those diplomatic conversations. The resistance network continues operating and continues learning from each engagement. The Empire reassesses and eventually deploys something else, because that is what empires do when they encounter problem they have not solved. And we will be here, he said, in this system, in this fight, I said, until it is finished, however long that takes. He looked at me for a long time. Admiral Shorak told me you would come, he said. He said it as a certainty, as if it were not something that could be otherwise. He was right, I said. He was right. The Cesar agreed quietly, but I've been thinking about why he was right, and I believe he understood it partially. He believed it because he had heard stories about human reliability, about the commitments humans make to their allies. He paused. But that is not the whole reason, is it? No, I said, it is not. You did not stay because of obligation. He said, you did not hold this system because of orders. You stayed because there was a problem here that you found. You were unable to leave unsolved, even when solving it was the most difficult thing you had available to do. I thought about that. We are very bad at leaving problems alone. I said, it is not always a virtue. In this case, he said it was. He moved toward the door. Rest, Captain. Your ship needs you. He left. I lay in the medical bay and listened to the quiet sounds of the ship around me. Ventilation, the low hum of systems that Ruiz and his team had repaired and restored and coaxed back to function. The distant rhythm of a crew going about the work of keeping a vessel operational after it had been through more than it was designed for. I had been thinking about what to put in the final log entry. For several days, I had composed and discarded a number of versions. Official language felt wrong. Tactical summary felt incomplete. The things that seemed most important were not the things that fitted neatly into a report format, so I recorded it the way it actually was. USS Blackstar supplemental log star date unknown. My chronometer took a direct hit in the last engagement, and the replacement has not arrived from stores yet, which is probably a fair representation of our current list of priorities. We held the line. We held it because there was a line to hold, and we were the ones who were there to hold it. And in my experience, that is the only reason that has ever mattered when it comes to it. Not orders, not the knowledge that the people on the other side of the line deserve protection, though they did completely and without any qualification. Not strategy, though. We had strategy. In my experience, when a line needs holding, you hold it. Because the alternative is letting go. And letting go is something that humans are not built for when something real is at stake. I have been thinking about what this will look like in 100 years, whether the records will show a battle or a turning point or a footnote in a longer story that is not finished being written. I do not know. I was not there for the 100 red year view. I was here in this system with this crew, with one working rail gun battery and a debris field that used to be 41 ships, and a chief engineer who builds solutions out of things that are not supposed to work. I have been thinking about Nora, Hale, and the 6 others. I will think about them for the rest of my life. That is not a dramatic statement, is simply true. People who do what she did do not stop being present just because they are gone. They stay in the way you do your job. They stay in the choices you make. When the choices are hard, I have always believed that the people we lose in moments like this do not disappear. They become part of the weight that makes you more careful and more committed the next time. The line needs holding to whoever is reading this after we are gone, because we'll be gone someday. All ships end, all missions end. I am not being pessimistic. I am just aware of time. We were small. We were afraid. We were running on too little sleep and too much determination, and the particular inability that humans have to leave a hard problem alone simply because it is larger than us. We were not extraordinary in any exceptional sense. We were people who looked at something that should not have been survivable and asked, what if we do not leave? What if we set the trap? What if we teach everyone around us what we know? What if one ship is enough to chain? What comes next? We asked those questions, and we answered them with the only answers we had, which were imperfect and costly and human in every sense of that word, but we answer them, and out there in 32 systems, the people who were supposed to accept what the Empire told them their future would be are still in the fight, and in 5 civilizations that had decided to keep their heads down and wait for things to settle. Someone is picking up a communication device and calling Earth for the first time. That is the whole story. One ship, one crew, one choice made before them. Was time to think too carefully about the consequences. Everything else is what grew from that. I would make the same choice again without hesitation, without qualification. I would pull into that debris field and look at what was left of 41 ships, and I would look at my crew and I would say, we are not leaving, because that is what we are. We are the ones who stay in log. Captain Aravo's USS Blackstar